Okay, welcome everyone to our program today. Understanding Piedmont's housing element, affordable housing in Piedmont. I'm Laurel Plimier, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and I'm happy to be bringing you this program today. The housing crisis in the Bay Area is troubling, and I know, as with most things, there's some misinformation floating around. So I hope that our panel will help give our viewers here a better understanding of the current situation, both here in Piedmont and in the broader community. So thank you all for choosing, as always, to spend a little bit of time with us here on Zoom and on YouTube and to learn about this important topic. So before we get to the introduction of our panel of speakers, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. If you are in the Zoom call with us, please remain muted for the duration of the event. This will minimize background noise, and it also keeps your picture from popping up in our video. You can post your questions for the panel either now or at any time during the presentation, either in the Zoom chat if you're with us on Zoom or in the live comments on YouTube. And I will ask as many of them as I can during the last half of the program. If you're joining us on YouTube, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell to get notifications of our future live stream events. And for advance notice of future events, you can join our mailing list, which you can do on our website, lwvpiedmont.org. And you can also become a member of the League there. Your dues alone supports the grassroots efforts of the League, both locally here in Piedmont and at the state and national levels. The League's efforts in voter education and advocacy are extremely important work right now and for the foreseeable future. So I am delighted to welcome our very distinguished panel of speakers today. We have with us Melissa Breach, who serves as Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at California YIMBY, which is Yes in My Backyard. She works to end the housing shortage and affordability crisis. Before joining California YIMBY in 2019, Melissa served as the executive director for the League of Women Voters of California, and she currently serves on the League of Women Voters of the US Board of Directors. We also have Rani Batra, who is leading the Citizens Piedmont Housing Advisory Committee, and she's also the current chair of the Piedmont Planning Commission. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia Darden Graduate School of Business and Vanderbilt University, and she has expertise in innovation and strategic marketing. And finally, we have Gloria Bruce, who is the executive director at East Bay Housing Organizations. That's the leading advocacy coalition promoting affordable housing in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. She has a master's degree in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley and a BA from Harvard. And she leads several policy and coalition campaigns. So we are going to get started with Melissa Breach from YIMBY.
Thank you so much, Laurel. Everyone, I just want to express how happy I am to be here. I think you can tell from the intro, this is like old home week for me. I am never happier than when I get to do a League event. So thank you so much for inviting me, LWV Piedmont. I also just want to take a second and say how excited I am, not just to get to talk to you for a few minutes, but also really excited to hear from my other panelists, Gloria and Rani. This is a really great panel that you put together. And so really looking forward to hearing from them and also hearing all of your comments, thoughts, and questions. Before I jump in, I just want to give a shout out to the League of Women Voters of California. Many of you may know this, but like in starting I think in 2020, but definitely 2021, the League has just been really pushing the envelope on housing reform policy and taking, just being incredibly present in Sacramento on the issue. And has really been kind of instrumental, I think, in helping move the dial on a lot of policy. So that's really exciting for me. And I hope you know that your state league is doing really kind of top-notch work in that area. So kudos to that team. I'm going to start out. It's always tricky with the league because you guys are a crazy informed audience. But I also find if I jump in the middle, you're all like, wait, where are you starting from? So I'm gonna try and do the summary really fast, and then I'm really gonna just try and give a little bit of a landscape assessment about kind of what happened this year and what's happened. Hopefully will happen next year. So 30 seconds on the bad news. California still has 25% of the country's homeless population, while it only has 12% of the country's population. We're short, and opinions on this number vary, but my number is we are short through 3.5 million homes in California. Probably a third of those needing to be, at least a third of those needing to be accessible to low income and very low income people. We are, despite claims that we are in a building boom, we are actually building at about a third of the rate that we were building in the 80s. So our rate of home building is so low right now that it's not even equivalent to keep our overall housing shortage from getting bigger every year. Lumber's at a record all-time high cost. It's almost unfathomable how much we're paying for lumber right now and labor. And at the end of September, the eviction moratorium, the pandemic eviction moratorium, was allowed to expire. So that's the bad news. Good news, after 2020, in which literally nothing substantial on housing policy could move at all in the state, due to, I think my generous tone would be due to the complexity of the legislature trying to manage the pandemic and making some hard choices. But also, I think, due to a lot of infighting, candidly, politically, between the houses, that was not in a very good service to the people of California. 2021 did not look like that. The governor has already signed, I think, 37 housing bills, which is incredibly exciting. He kicked it off by signing, well, actually, before I jump into the bills, let me say this, because I think one of the biggest things that happened this year was an unprecedented investment in affordable housing, right? So we're looking at what, 10.3 billion has been set aside for affordable housing. An additional 12 billion specific for housing for people struggling with homelessness. And then I think 3 to 4 billion something in there for mental health housing beds, which is kind of housing, but also mental health services. That is an unprecedented number. It is also not remotely what we need. So I think we can do 2 things at once. We can say, wow, that is a really unprecedented number and we're moving in the right direction. And gosh, we're gonna have to figure out how to do better. Still, it was really exciting to see. The governor also signed 37 housing bills, and some of the very first bills he signed in this entire season were SB 8, SB 9, and SB 10. I'm going to call those out because the League of Women Voters of California specifically had endorsed, I believe, all 3 of those. And California YIMBY was the lead advocate on SB 9 and the lead sponsor on SB 10. I think, you know, SB 9 was an extension of the Housing Crisis Act. So it was an extension of SB 330. SB 9 was probably the most controversial bill this year, which I think is insane because it actually passed in 2020. So for those of you who don't remember, it passed out of the Senate at 11:58 p.m., but could not get back to the Senate for concurrence, which was part of the infighting, I think, between the houses, but that's neither here nor there. The point being, we were really surprised that a bill that had gotten through both houses last year was so controversial this year, but SB 9 was the bill that allows for duplexes and lot splits on most of California. And I think both proponents, which we are in opposition, would frame it as the bill that ended single family zoning in California, which for me is a very happy thing. But and then SB 10 was a bill that allowed, basically allowed local governments of their own kind of decision to be able to streamline and avoid CEQA regulations for residential housing up to 10 units. It's more complex than that, but that's a quick summary. In addition to that, there were 30 some other bills working on everything from streamlining to zoning to affordability. Really kind of great year. What didn't get done? And I will just say, I invite you to ask questions about these bills in Q&A, but there's too many for me to figure out what you want to know. So I would say that the things that are looming for next year. So there was a bill that we sponsored, the league endorsed along with a lot of other organizations, but it was pretty controversial, AB 1401, which is a bill that does away with parking requirements for development of buildings close to transit hubs. That bill is technically a 2-year bill, but I don't think it's going to get out. So we'll have to see if it comes back in a different vehicle next year. I really hope it does. Eliminating parking requirements near transit is a great way to lower the cost of housing. The other bill that I think will get out next year is SCA 2. I can't stress how important SCA 2 is. It is the bill that would amend the Constitution. It would create a ballot measure that would amend the Constitution that would keep communities from being able to vote down affordable housing, basically in the way they are right now. And another bill that I will mention, just because it's a pet project of mine, was we had a bill to end the mortgage interest tax deduction for second homes, for vacation homes that would have brought $500 million, I think, per year in for either first-time home buyer programs or affordable home ownership programs. Okay, so let's see, where are we? I have about 3 minutes left. So what are the big things that we can do, I think, to solve our housing crisis? And I do want to say, for the record, this comes up quite a bit. I work a lot on the market side of things. The market cannot, in and of itself, solve California's housing crisis. Just can't. But we cannot even begin to solve the housing crisis without a market strategy. So it is a nuanced issue, but it is an important one. And so really figuring out how to legalize more multifamily housing, which is inherently less expensive because the costs are spread across multiple units and people. Driving those, making sure we can build those in high opportunity neighborhoods so that working families get a chance to live with great schools, great parks, great resources, and all of the health and economic benefits that inure just because you have an address in a specific location. Continuing to protect vulnerable tenants from displacement, providing more public funding for subsidized and social public housing, which is a really interesting idea. If people have Q&As about it, we can talk about the difference between social housing and subsidized affordable. Ensure all Californians kind of continue to have secure housing during and after COVID-19. The one thing I will say that's not on this list, but I really want to call out, is I think in the quest to protect tenants, to avoid displacement, to minimize those kind of impacts, one of the big things we need to do is figure out a proactive strategy. Because the strategy has been like, should we build or not? And really, we need to figure out a way to build in such a way that the benefits disproportionately return to the people who live and work in that community. And I think that is still a really big question on how to do that and how to do that well. And then I guess the last thing that I will say is that we are trying to figure out, so this I will say, we talk about housing, and I'm sure this isn't true in the loop, we talk about policy. What's the right policy? Well, everybody has a slightly different opinion about policy. In general, there's a lot of consensus and a lot of consensus in the data. We don't have so much of a policy problem as we have a political problem. And so I feel like I wanted to say that because I think the work is really to reshape the public dynamic of how the public understands a neighborhood, how the public thinks of home ownership, home rental, what it looks like to live the American dream. Does it really involve you have to live 2 hours away so you can have a white picket fence, but you don't get to see your kids play their baseball game? Like, what does that look like? I think that's the big conversation we're having. Yeah, and I think that's everything. And I'm at 10. Oh, I apologize. I am supposed to kick it to Rani. Rani, you are up next.
Okay. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And I feel like YIMBY has really helped the public generally understand some of the pain points in California and how they affect people, and what we can do to, improve the situation for everyone in California. So thank you for that. And thank you to League of Women Voters for everything that you guys do to help us all stay informed about really important issues of the day. I've enjoyed a lot of your events in the past and look forward to doing more of that. My name is Rani Batra, and I'm here on behalf of the Housing Advisory Committee. I'm also joined by Kevin Jackson and Pierce McDonald Powell from the city of Piedmont. They are my partners and are really helping us as a city update our housing element and begin to implement and respond to some of the new legislation and the great need in the state of California and in the Bay Area for more affordable housing. So I'm going to share my slides. I have a few slides to run through a little bit about how we're doing this. And my main goal is to try to demystify the alphabet soup of acronyms that you tend to get thrown at you when you hear about housing. So hopefully you'll feel a little bit more informed about what all these letters and numbers mean. And secondly, to inspire you to get involved, because this is really a community-based effort, and we want to hear from all parts of the community, because it's you know, we know in Piedmont, because we've seen it over and over again, that when this community comes together and we've got incredible talent, passion, expertise, resourcefulness, and when we bring all those things to bear, really great things happen. And I'm confident that we can bring all of those, you know, sort of hard and soft resources to bear on this challenge, to find some great ways to make more room in Piedmont for more people. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And talk to you about what this process is called and how it's going to work. So this, you'll probably see in some of the local press discussion about the housing element update. That is really the process by which we'll shape our strategy and vision over, you know, the next period of time. This is a collective effort. So I mentioned Kevin Jackson and Pierce McDonald Powell from the city of Piedmont, who have been, you know, working tirelessly to understand all the ins and outs of the gazillion bills that just got passed and what the implications of those are for Piedmont. We have also approved and retained a consulting team that's very experienced in these matters and has advised cities around California. So Lisa Wise Consulting and one of her partners, their partners, Plan to Place, is actively involved in this effort. And then we have a housing advisory committee, of which I'm the chair. And there are 4 other members: June Catalano, Jane Lynn, Justin Osler, and Claire Parisa. I think I saw Claire here on the call today. And so you'll see, you know, there are Piedmonters represented through the housing advisory committee, to really reach out to the community and reflect, you know, different ideas for how to meet this challenge. So just, I know we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to cover some of the basics. I think it's important to understand that housing element, the laws around housing elements were enacted in 1969, really in response to civil rights legislation. So the entire idea of providing a housing element and updating it periodically was based on a sort of broader understanding at a state level that we need to make room for folks in a fair way. And we need to actually rethink how that happens periodically, because you can't just set it in stone and leave it alone forever. And so that really came out of much of the work that was done in civil rights in the 60s. The housing element is part of the city's general plan, which is kind of a governing document that lays out, you know, a bunch of aspects for how the city operates. The housing element specifically assesses what are the housing needs within Piedmont, what is a roadmap for accommodating projected housing needs, and then, you know, setting specific measurable goals and supporting policies and programs to help achieve those goals. So that's kind of, when you hear the term housing element, that's what we're talking about. The housing elements are updated every 8 years. So there's a cycle. You'll hear the term, you know, we're in the 6th cycle. So this is not our first rodeo as Piedmont. We've done it before. What's new about it this time is the change in legislation. And I would say the change in public sentiment. I think there's been a change broadly around the Bay Area and within Piedmont about people understanding this is a pressing need, and also it's important for all of us to make room for others within our community to address a lot of the social justice issues that we've you know, become increasingly and somewhat painfully aware of over the last few years. HCD is another term you'll hear. That's the California Department of Housing and Community Development, and they review all of the housing elements to make sure that they're in compliance with state laws. So they're sort of the approval body for the update that we're doing in this cycle. And the components of a housing element include a bunch of different aspects, evaluating, sort of looking backwards to see, well, how did we do on the last housing element? Did we hit the goals we set for ourselves, and what did we learn? What is an assessment of the needs? What are adequate sites? So taking inventory of sites that could be buildable in Piedmont. And as we all know, our town is tiny and the amount of buildable land is pretty limited. And so, really understanding where are those opportunities and what might be needed to tap into them. Understanding what are the resources available to develop, preserve, or rehabilitate housing. What are some of the constraints? And then a new component, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing. So really understanding what our role can be in addressing some of the inequities of history, really. And then what's a specific implementation plan to help achieve the goals that are set out. And we talked a little bit about, I mentioned affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's a new element through AB 686. That goes a little bit deeper in analyzing segregation issues and identifying fair housing goals and specific strategies to really address inequities. There are some carrots, if you call it, some incentives to help achieve housing element goals. A number of different programs, some with funds attached to them that we can avail ourselves of, some of which will be very appropriate for Piedmont and some of which will not be very appropriate for Piedmont. So that's part of the work that Kevin and Pierce and Lisa Wise and her team are going to help us do, is to understand, well, which of these make sense for us and do we want to tap into them? Some of them are really not intended for sort of a community like Piedmont that's relatively privileged. And so there's some questions about, should we even avail ourselves of those funds, or should they go to other communities that may need them more? And other programs may make a lot of sense for us. There's also some sticks involved. So if we're not compliant, there are different ways that the state can, impose penalties or consequences. But it is our intention and the work that we're all doing together is to be in compliance, and more importantly, to actually try to solve some of these issues. So it's, being compliant with the letter of the law, but also, really seeing if we can make room for people in Piedmont. Okay, so we're in the 6th cycle of a housing element update. Another acronym you've probably seen or heard is ABAG. That's the Association of Bay Area Governments, and they do sort of a broader look at the Bay Area in terms of what are the regional needs for housing. And then they do acronym number 4, I think we're up to, RHNA allocation, regional housing needs allocation. So that is sort of that's a number or a target that they set for each city. For how many new housing units do we expect, each city to produce over the next cycle. And so that's the number that sort of gets handed down from RHNA. They have a methodology for doing this that includes access to opportunities. So they want to see more building, as Melissa mentioned earlier, in high resource areas where there's proximity to jobs, so that we're not building a whole bunch of units where someone's commuting for 2 hours to get to their job. And then also addressing issues of social equity. Sorry, my screen just got stuck. Okay, so our RHNA target is 587 units over the next 8 years. To put that in perspective, our RHNA target for the 5th cycle was 60 units. So it's nearly a 10x increase in units. And I think that's an important thing to understand in terms of both, the magnitude of the challenge and opportunity, and also the level of creativity and change that we may need to undertake to achieve it. I think that's a big difference. Those 587 units, they've projected those requirements across the spectrum of extremely low and very low income, all the way to above moderate income. So, you'll see that about 28% of the units are expected to be within the extremely and very low income range. And if I remember the figures correctly from when we dug into this at one of our previous meetings, that think of that as about a $1,500 a month rental. That's just to put that in perspectives of what you might rent a unit out for if you built an ADU or a unit on a property. And then it goes up from there. And then about 40% are at the other end of the spectrum of above moderate income. And we must make enough. So our job in the housing element update is to identify land and sites to accommodate the RHNA. So adjust, finding the sites and enabling policies to enable the production of these houses. That doesn't mean the city is going to build the houses, right? That we've got to have capital and effort required and, people required, resources engaged to actually do the building. But we need to sort of pave the way for those, for that production to occur. Screen seems to be stuck again. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so what does that process look like? This is a 2-year process. You'll see on the lower right, it says we are here, or we were here in September. So we kicked off this process in May. We have done some initial site inventory and kind of laid out the longer term plan for this next, for the 2-year process or cycle. We did kind of a study session in September with the Planning Commission and the Housing Advisory Committee, really reviewing some of the information you're seeing tonight to really get to the brass tacks of what are we actually doing with this housing element update. And then we're going to be having some public events. There'll be a public workshop in December that I encourage you all to attend if you can. And that the consulting team, Lisa Wise and her team, are going to be doing, or in the midst of doing, a much deeper dive on technical issues, capacity, specific sites, looking at other cities around the state to see, if there's lessons that can be learned from other people's, other cities' efforts. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of work underway that will culminate in the first of the year in 2022 with, kind of a understanding of the landscape, like where are we, what are the opportunities to build, and then more public input. So there'll be a draft housing element produced in March that will be available for the public to review. There'll be more workshops and hearings next spring. And then we will have a draft that's sort of HCD ready in July of 2022. Another 60 days for HCD to review it and for the public to understand and kind of, get more familiar with what's in that draft element. More iterating. This is an iterative process, as you can see. And then in November of next year, we would have a final draft housing element that would ideally be approved and adopted by January of 2023. So that's kind of the time frame for this work. The public has, the Piedmonters have been involved already. We did a fair housing survey in the spring of this year that garnered, over 850 responses, which is fantastic in a town the size of ours. So people have started to really get their heads around this topic and provide some input. We've done a number of community events to sort of talk to folks. It's nice to be able to get out and do face-to-face engagement again in a safe way. And then we are also, Lisa Wise and the city are held a number of focus groups with different constituencies within Piedmont to really get the perspective from, subject matter experts in different parts of Piedmont. We are also looking for ways to get input from people who don't live in Piedmont, because one of the challenges of Piedmont is it's hard to live here. It's hard to find a place to live, to find a home for sale at any price point, frankly, but particularly at an affordable price point. So one of the charges that we've given the team is to really let's see how we can hear voices that aren't in the community, because that's really those are the needs we're trying to address here. And then I'm just going to get into a little bit more. You'll see, because particularly now that face-to-face is a little bit more challenging, We're also doing, in addition to some of the workshops, doing some social media engagement and digital engagement. So we have a website called piedmontisHome.org, where all of the events that we do are posted there, so you can see them. You can go back and watch events and read some of the materials that are shared. You'll see videos posted to, again, continue to inform people. One of the questions we asked in our survey in the spring is, how familiar are you with the housing element update? And about 50% said not very familiar. So that was a good wake-up call for us that the job number one is just to educate the public. These are intimidating topics to folks that don't know all the acronyms, and we want to help bring that intimidation factor down so that folks can share their thoughts and ideas. You'll see newsletters and community events, the community workshops, and then of course our Housing Advisory Committee meetings and the City Council and Planning Commission meetings, all of which will deal with these topics. And those are all public events that anyone in the community can attend, ask questions, etc. This is just kind of a work plan of all the stuff I just talked about, so I won't spend any time on it. But I'll take my last couple seconds to plug the events that are coming up. So again, December 2nd, mark your calendars, is a public housing element community workshop. So this is really an idea generating kind of interactive session. And I know this town is full of talented, creative people who know a lot about this topic. And I would love for all of you to come to the workshop and bring your ideas. It's going to take creativity to meet these goals. And then our next sort of larger Housing Advisory Committee meeting is in early 22. If you want to get updates on when these events are happening so they stay on your radar screen, you can go to piedmontishome.org, put your email in there, and you will get an email in your inbox with information periodically. And I think that's a nice way to stay up to date and keep some of these events on your radar screen. And that is the end of my slides. I think I'm gonna hand the baton over to Gloria Bruce to round out our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Rani. That was great. Really honored to be here with these two other panelists, and also just to be here at the invitation of the League of Women Voters. I have to say, whatever chapter of the League I've interacted with, I've just always been impressed by the really thorough way that you educate folks in the community. So when I got the invitation from Julie Chang, I was like, sure, I can make this work. And the other thing I want to say is that I'm actually not the person on my team who heads up most of the housing element work, but because last fall I spoke to another group of Piedmonters about housing issues and was just really excited that so many people in your community are expressing renewed interest in this. I wanted to continue that relationship, and it's nice to see a couple of people who I met at that last Zoom here in the room. So it's nice to see you all again. So for those who I have not met before, let me tell you just a little bit about East Bay Housing Organizations and what we do, and then what we have seen and what we hope to see in these rounds of housing elements. Oh, it's funny, Melissa, I was gonna say that. So I will get to that. No worries. So again, my organization is called East Bay Housing Organizations. It's organizations with an S, which I know is a little funky to say, but that's because we are a membership group. We we have a staff of 11 awesome folks, but we also constitute about 300 member organizations and individuals. And what I say is anybody who is dedicated to housing justice and to making sure people have safe, affordable housing in the East Bay, who subscribes to our values and pays their dues, is welcome to be a member. But mostly what that looks like is on the organizational side, we have a lot of folks who are nonprofit providers and developers of affordable homes. We have a lot of people who also work in the affordable housing industry. So architects and contractors who build affordable homes, people who work in local government to support and facilitate affordable housing. And then we also have a lot of other types of groups, community organizations, faith groups, and then on the individual side, We have people who have themselves been impacted by the housing crisis. So residents of affordable housing and a lot of other individuals who are just like, I want to know what to do about this situation in my community. And so we bring them all together. And then as staff, we advance policy and advocacy on a number of issues. So I wasn't going to bring slides today, but then I realized there were just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. So I am actually going to share my screen just in just a moment, because there's a couple of things I'd like to show. And yeah, let me actually just go ahead and pull that up first before I keep speaking. I'll mute so you can hear my coworker, my spouse in the background. Great. So some of you, hopefully you can see that. Some of you may have seen a similar version of some of these slides when I presented last year. I'm not going to go over all of them, but just a few to ground where we are. So come along, advance. Let's advance. There we go. Melissa gave a really good sense of the context, but just to bring it home again, these are some numbers from Alameda County. Again, they're from last year, but the point remains that the level of what we need to solve for is really huge. And that means every community needs to do part of it needs to do its fair share. And a lot of times, EBHO is asked, we work in a lot of different jurisdictions throughout the East Bay of every type. We're based in Oakland, but we work in a lot of different cities. And sometimes we're asked the question, why are you doing work in places like Walnut Creek or Rinda? And it's like, well, because, lots of reasons, but first of all, there is no city that is insulated from the housing crisis, whether it's as simple as there are kids who grew up in that community and then moved away from college and want to move back to the community where they were raised, and it's completely out of the question, and then their parents want to have them back in that city, but it's just not workable unless they live in the basement, to the much more severe issues of people being unhoused, or even in cities like Piedmont that doesn't have a huge commercial district, to put it lightly. Every city has people who work there in low and moderate wage jobs, teachers, retail workers, servers, domestic workers, and I think it would often be better for everyone if those folks could live closer to where they work, and there are more options for people of various means, even in communities that are generally thought of as communities of opportunity, which are often more diverse than they seem to be beneath the surface. And I also know that Rani sort of I think referred to kind of changing public sentiment, and I think there is an increasing desire in communities to say, hey, it's actually time for us to revisit the legacy of what on the surface looks like a beautiful community of single family homes and expansive lawns and gorgeous hidden stairs and all that. We love that. I love that. And at the same time, some of that comes out of a legacy of exclusion, of quite purposeful racial exclusion. What can we do to redress that while at the same time maintaining what we love about our community? And that's why it's actually exciting for me to work in communities that are at least some of whom are willing to have that conversation. So the way that we take that on, I'm not going to actually land on this one. Let me go to this one. Yes. So the way we take that on as EBHO is through a framework which is becoming increasingly common, which is the 3 Ps, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. So it's 3 Ps of housing, meaning we need to do all of these things. We have to protect people where they are, which means, protecting tenants, giving rental assistance, making sure people aren't sliding into displacement and homelessness. It also means production, so producing or creating, building homes of all types that people can afford. And then preserving existing housing that we do have that is affordable, whether it's just, smaller apartments that just happen to be affordable because they're smaller and older, or whether it's actively going in and renovating homes and making sure that they're owned by a nonprofit organization that can keep them deed restricted and affordable. My organization works on all 3 of these Ps, and I know that Melissa was talking, and YIMBY does as well. I think we have many similarities. We probably have some differences in emphasis, and so we probably, while I know that Melissa and her folks are very pro protection, we probably focus on that a bit more, as well as the production. And the only friendly amendment I'd like to give to what Melissa said earlier about what happened at the state level in 2020. Absolutely. Nothing happened on production at the state level in 2020. That was incredibly frustrating to us for many, many reasons. However, some things we didn't think we'd ever see happen in housing happened, as in Project Home Key, enabling hotels and motels to be turned around into interim housing really quickly, and protections for tenants and rental assistance for tenants on a scale we didn't think we would see. So there's all sorts of things swirling around is the point I want to make there. So how do we actually achieve these 3 Ps of housing, and what does that look like for the housing element process specifically? A lot of times what we say is that what is needed to create affordable housing is 3 big things: land, resources, and public will. And really, a city technically only has jurisdictional power over 2 of those things, right? The land and the resources, AKA the money, and the money is usually pretty limited. The housing element has to do with the first of those things, primarily the land. Zoning, though, so as Rani laid out so well, it's not about the city actually being, the entity that builds the housing. Cities don't tend to build housing themselves. That's not how it works, but the city has to enable the use of that land for those things, and often by zoning for slightly denser housing than what's there. I like to talk about not ending single family zoning, but ending single family only zoning. To me, that's a really critical distinction. I live in a single family home. I love it. My kids make a lot of noise, as I'm sure you're hearing. I like to sing really loud. I'm glad I don't have, walls that attach to another unit, but I've also lived in apartments and been glad to do so. And so it's not that I want that someone's going to come in and tear down my house to build a duplex. They can't do that if I don't want them to. But that I love the fact that I live next to a 9-unit apartment building and across the street from a home that has an ADU. And I think that's the type of things that we should be facilitating a little bit more. So that's what we're going to be talking about as EBHO when we follow housing elements around the region. We want to see that robust zoning that allows not just only for single family. As Melissa mentioned, there are 101 jurisdictions in the Bay Area. 27 of those, I believe, appealed their RHNA numbers, said, we don't, for various reasons of various degrees of legitimacy, said, no, we don't like how much you gave us. Piedmont did not appeal. So I appreciate that, and I hope that's an element of good faith efforts to accommodate the admittedly quite high bar of 587 units, with I believe 250 of those being very low and low income. So what we are going to continue to look for cities is that trying in good faith to meet that goal, working hard on the affirmatively furthering fair housing that Rani spoke about, especially with that eye to racial equity and inclusion, and then also a really robust public process. And I have to say, I visit a lot of housing department websites, and Piedmont is home is really nice. So I have to give a shout out. I know Piedmont staff are on the line here, and it's a really nice website. And Kevin, I thought your explainer video was really good. So that's one big piece right there, is clear public information. In my last couple of minutes, what I was asked to give some examples of are success stories. What are other communities like Piedmont that have done a great job at this? I wish I could say, here's these awesome cities that have met their RHNA goals and have built all the housing and all the income levels that they need to do. I don't have that success story for you, because the sad reality is that for various reasons, ranging from market pressure to public pressure, the general trend is that the bigger cities have maybe met their RHNA goals on the moderate or above market side of things, usually above moderate, and almost no one has met their goals on the lower tranches of production. And that's where we really, really need to beef things up. So I don't have the great success stories of, these are people who've checked off the boxes on all their RHNA. And again, it's not entirely up to the cities, but I think we are starting to see some examples of the impact that the housing element has and what community members can do. So one example, and maybe this isn't on the positive side in the beginning, but one example is the city of Pleasanton, where we used to do a lot of work. Pleasanton actually was sued over 10 years ago over a housing cap that it had. It said, you can't build more than 3,000 affordable units in the city of Pleasanton. And advocates came and sued the city and said, actually, that's not in line with housing element law or what your own housing element says the advocates won, and Pleasanton had to remove that housing cap. At the time, there were a lot of people who were quite unhappy about that. But I'm pleased to share that since then, the city knowing, okay, this is real, this is enforceable, this is not, you know, some document that we can ignore. And since then, there have been a number of several affordable housing projects that have gone forward in that city that I think now have gotten a lot of acceptance. And one of those is this one right here that I like to show because I think, you know, I've been to this property. I'm sure the landscaping is much more lush now. It's a really beautiful example of how you can fit in a lot of units at a relatively low density in a way that looks really approachable. There is a more dense part of this property. This is senior housing, but these are little cottages and they're just lovely. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that the type of nonprofit developers who work with EBHO are very used to building within the appropriate context for their city. No one's going to put a high rise in a low density, almost ex-urban town like Pleasanton, or in a beautiful, historic, leafy town like Piedmont. People know how to build within the context. And I've actually learned in the last year that a lot of people within our affordable housing industry are Piedmonters and are working on this from the inside. So I think that you'll have a lot of great ideas, as Rani was saying. One other one I want to show you really quick. This is Monteverde Senior Housing in Orinda. And so I picked Orinda because, again, it's a relatively much less dense than Piedmont, but smaller community of what we call a community of opportunity. From this view, this might look a little bit, to some, not to me, because I'm a city girl, this might look a little looming. But what you're not seeing here is that this is on, you can kind of get a sense it's on a slope, and actually from the street, you're sort of at one end of it, and it kind of just gently goes up these terraces. It has these outdoor patios. And as you can see, it actually really never gets above 3 stories. And it's actually a really lovely community that fits in quite well on the hillside that it's in. And so, you know, these are the types of things that we want to encourage in some of the more affluent communities and what I think is possible. So just to close out, you know, one thing I wanted to point out, I said before, the 3 things you need are land, resources, and public will, and public and political will. The way for a city to have that public will and that political will is for people, hopefully people like you, to be making it clear to your decision makers and to your neighborhoods that you are open to supporting affordable housing and inclusive housing, because then your decision makers can stand up for it when that comes before them. And we saw a very clear example of this recently in the city of Livermore, where the city had already designated public land for an affordable housing project, and where a ton of neighbors came out in opposition, and actually opposition that was actually quite racially coded and actually very upsetting. The city council, both the planning commission and the city council, to their credit, stuck to their guns, and they said, no, we need this housing for the people who work in our restaurants and in our stores. This is a great site. It's owned by the city. We have money from Measure A1 from the county. We hear what you're saying, people. But we also hear from the people who are supporting, and we are doing this. And they were able to do that because, along with all the naysayers, there were enough people who came out in support. The city council members knew that some people had their backs. And that's what helps create the public will that can really shift things. So I think that's just important to keep in mind. You're at a moment where there is money from the county Measure A1 that Piedmont does have and hasn't allocated yet. You know, I think there's a lot of opportunity at the moment. I hope you all very much take advantage of it. And from what I've seen of the website so far, I'm pleased with that piece. So I will pause there because I think I'm at the end of my time, but I just wanted to show those 2 examples. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. Oh, but just to point out, success is possible. Like I said, with Measure A1, a lot of affordable homes have been built. A lot of home ownership has been assisted, and there's almost 3,000 affordable homes have been created yet. None yet in Piedmont. So let's see what we can do. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. And Melissa and Rani, excellent information. I have a ton of questions. I know I will not be able to get through them all, so I apologize in advance. I would like to start with a little bit of sort of general policy questions, which maybe Melissa can answer, but anyone can jump in, feel free. So can you speak a little bit about the difference between social housing and subsidized affordable housing, and how that plays into what you talked about, that market is not enough and we need more than just market influences?
Sure. And I invite other people to kick in too if they have different thoughts. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that when we say capital A affordable housing, we mean deed restricted, subsidized with public money, affordable housing for people who are low income or very low income. 91% of low income Californians live in market rate housing. We could 10 times the money going to public housing, subsidized public housing, and the majority of low income people would still live in market rate housing. So we need a market rate. We need a public investment, a massive public investment. We need to protect and claw back affordable housing as it's expiring. And we need to kind of set up incentives in the marketplace that make it easier to build less lowercase affordable housing, which is to say it's smaller, it is, denser, for whatever reasons, it's less expensive. It's on a smaller lot. The thing about social housing, and this is kind of I think we've been talking about this for a couple of years. Alex Lee and Buffy Wicks, I know, are working on it. We've been in conversations, but social housing is just, it can be and is often deed restricted affordable housing, but it can also just be housing. Like the city or the state can choose, or any entity can choose to build housing. Some of that can be for low income and very low income people. Others of it could be market rate, that they charge market rate for. As a matter of fact, in the 40s and 50s, most of the housing built in the country with public money was workforce housing. So it's an opportunity to think about integrated housing, where we have people at different levels of income living collaboratively and together. And we're also, where we see is there an opportunity for government to meet a need that maybe the market is not meeting effectively, but be able to recoup some of that investment if it's also being used by people who can afford to pay for it. And so I would expect to see another bill on this in next year, and that it's going to be a big statewide conversation, I think, over the next couple of years. I will say there have been big failures around social housing in other states, but I do think it's something California could do and do well if they were inclined. That's the short version, which was maybe long.
Thank you. So that ties in a little bit to what are the incentives for building the lower income housing, and are those incentives available here in Piedmont? Because it seems like the cost, like you said, even just lumber right now, everything is ultra expensive. You can barely afford to build at market rates. How is that possibly going to work if you're not going to get anywhere near market rate for the housing?
So I think that's true. I think there's another thing that we don't talk about a lot. We talk about building affordable housing, which is critically important, but it's also a longer term strategy. It takes time, especially in California, because we don't have ministerial approval. So maybe one of the things that I will say is that one of the big incentives that we can have is we can make it faster and cheaper to build. So we can reduce fees to build. We can candidly move away from the idea that it's discretionary. Why is it that if a builder like MidPenn is coming forth and saying, I have a plan, it complies with your zoning laws, it complies with your, it complies with your housing law, why is it that the neighbors get to come in and say, I don't want that? Why is it that we have discretionary approval that can then extend? Because if it takes 4 years to get approval, right? What we're doing is we're saying the risk becomes really high for builders, and they have to, especially in the market, in the missing middle space, they have to go, okay, do I really want to build for the missing middle, or do I want to squeeze every little bit of dime out, which means, building the biggest, most expensive thing I kind of know I can sell. So I think there's tools here, but one of the critical problems is that it's really easy to say, aren't developers greedy bastards? Some of them are. But it's really easy to vilify them instead to say we have a systems problem in terms of how we go about building housing, and a cultural problem in terms of what we think we are entitled to. And one of those pieces is I too am sitting in a single family home on 1/3 of an acre, looking out at open space. I bought it because I love it. If my city came to me and said, we're going to put 160 units in that open space, and that's going to be marketed at a price point for teachers and people who work in this community, you know, I would be sad, but I wouldn't oppose it because it's what's best for my community. And I think that's something that's missing in our discourse around housing. It's like, I bought it, I have the right for my community to stay the same.
Thank you. I want to turn now to the housing element. So I have a lot of questions on the housing element, and we can start with, can you, one of you, maybe Rani, clarify the relationship between the housing element itself and the RHNA allocation? And I know you've talked a little bit about how you know, the property is mostly privately owned, so we're not talking about the city going and building houses. But I think that there is some confusion about the relationship between those RHNA numbers and what the city is actually required to do, and how that translates to actual homes being built in Piedmont.
So, no, it's a good question. So the RHNA is a target. It's probably the most simple way to describe it. So 587 unit target for this upcoming 6th cycle. The housing element update is really policies and, you know, so sort of the rules of the road within Piedmont for how things get built. And so some examples of things that can be done through the housing element is, you know, availing ourselves of different programs that are available statewide to incentivize production. Creating, one thing we are doing is creating objective design standards for ADUs so that it simplifies, as Melissa was alluding to, and Gloria as well, simplifying the process and the cost of actually creating an ADU. So that you can have a little bit slightly a more off-the-shelf solution. I don't want to say completely off the shelf because Piedmont's small, and tucking anything into someone's small lot is going to require some level of customization. We don't have 2-acre lots here. But simplifying that process will bring the cost down and the time down considerably. So the housing element update is, you know, is a set of tools that we can avail ourselves up and offer up to the community to help enable the achievement of those 587 units. The other thing I would say is that HCD, which is the body that approves the housing element, they do kind of a reality check on this. So we can't just do kind of a pie in the sky plan that says, we're just going to put an ADU in everybody's yard and that's how we're going to get there. They're going to say, well, how have you done in the past cycle in building ADUs? We're going to use that production as the baseline to sort of sanity check your assumptions. So they don't just sort of take the number and trust us. They want to make sure that there's goals that make sense, that they're calibrated against some history of our production, and that there's some policy changes or changes in the rules within Piedmont to enable the production so that it's feasible. And so I hope that kind of gives people some color about what those two things mean.
One follow-up question to that, can you clarify, so we have this number 587 or similar. Does that mean that within this 8 years, this 8-year cycle, there will be another 587 homes in Piedmont? Or is it that just that Piedmont needs to step out of the way and make sure that the zoning laws allow for those 587 units? And why don't you start with that, and then I have another follow-up question.
Sure.
And I mean, I could answer that if you want.
Thank you, Kevin. I was just going to ask you because you've got.
Yeah, right. So the law doesn't require us to build them. the city itself, we need to allow for them to remove barriers and constraints that prevent them from being built either through regulation constraints or market rates constraints, and put in place regulation, laws, policies, programs that facilitate the production of that housing.
And so my follow-up question is then, if that housing is not built, so you have met the bar and you've put in the policies in place so that it could potentially be built, is there any negative repercussions from the state if the housing does not actually get built? And then if you want to keep going with that question, how did we do in our last cycle in that regard?
Currently, state law does not level penalties that would be burdensome for us if that housing did not get produced. There have been bills over the last few years that would include some of those, but it does, because we can't control the market as a city, but we can control the regulations and policies that are put in place. So, I couldn't say that over the years there wouldn't be a penalty that comes with some new legislation, but at the moment, we have to do annual reports to the state that show how many new housing units have been permitted, how many have been built, what income level are they, and so we have to report so that they get that data, and it also gives us an indication of how well we're doing and what might need to be modified in order to meet the goals. But to answer your question, there isn't a big penalty for the lack of production, but there is a penalty for not enabling and facilitating it.
And have we been successful with our past housing?
Right, so our allocation for the 5th cycle was 60 units, and we were well on our way to supplying the number of housing units and the affordable ones with our ADU program, which is no longer that productive since the state no longer prohibits cities from requiring parking within half a mile of transit, which is all of Piedmont. So we're getting plenty of ADU permits and a couple of new houses, but in the last few years, they have not been affordable. By deed restriction, you can indicate that some of the JADUs and the smaller ADUs are affordable by nature, but the deed restricted ones have not been produced beyond the early parts of the 5th cycle.
So a couple follow-up questions on this topic. So you had talked, Rani, about being creative in the types of things the city will need to do in order to meet that RHNA number. Is that something that the citizens in Piedmont will have a chance to vote on, or is that something that the city council is going to make a decision on and move forward with, or a little bit of both?
Kevin, do you want to?
Yeah. So the city council is the decision maker on the housing element and the policies and regulations that are part of that process. And the public does have the opportunity to influence the city council's decision making by attending public meetings, sending comments, reviewing the draft housing element, and participating in the process. They can also participate by adding units to their properties, either JADUs or ADUs or under SB 9, a duplex. So there's ways.
So if there is a zoning change within Piedmont that changes single family zoning to something other than single family zoning, the city council can do that without without a vote?
The indication we got from the city attorney was that if the zone allows housing, any changes to what type of housing that might be is something that the city council can do without having the issue be going to the voters. If we changed the designation of a zone from one use to another, or if we change the boundaries of that zone, the charter requires that go to a vote. But I will say that all zones in Piedmont allow for a single family dwelling.
Thank you. So I have one question. I do have more questions on the RHNA. I will get back to that, but I have one question for Gloria specifically. Can you provide more information on affirmatively furthering work that can be in the housing element, and maybe some examples of how that works?
I can start that, and I bet Melissa can actually really add. Like I said, I am so fortunate that I have a 3-person policy team who really digs in on things on this kind of stuff. But affirmatively furthering fair housing is actually a term and a concept and set of policies that's been around for a while on the federal level through HUD, and it's a very awkward way of saying you have to be proactively assuring that housing is accessible regardless of protected classes. So race and income, and people of all colors and all types have to be able to access the housing. We recently put out a letter that we sent to all of the planning directors in the region, and we also sent to ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, saying that our interpretation of the recently beefed up AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing goals in the housing element, many of them pertain to the assessment that has to happen. So really making sure that when a jurisdiction goes and does its needs assessments, that it is asking those questions. What are the demographics of this community? What's the history of this community around racial exclusion and hopefully racial inclusion, but more often, unfortunately, it's the opposite. What are the kinds of proactive policies that can be in place to unwind that? Whether it's, certainly we like to see construction of nonprofit owned affordable multifamily housing. It could also be proposing that cities move ordinances that say landlords aren't allowed to discriminate against Section 8 holders. For example, if someone has a housing voucher, that in and of itself can't be the reason that they're turned away from an apartment, because that's discriminatory based on their source of income. So there's a lot of different things that could look like. And one of the other main things in the letter that we and our coalition partners pointed out was a lot of it had to do with public process, just saying that, like so many things in the housing world, if you really do want to make this a tool for more inclusion and more fair housing, you have to make sure that all elements of the community are included in the public outreach process. And here's the ways to do that: doing things in multiple languages, multiple different formats, especially given the constraints of COVID. From what Rani laid out, it looks like a lot of that is actually underway here, which is great to see. So many of our comments on AFFH have focused on the outreach and engagement process.
I'm going to continue with, we only have about 5 minutes left, but I'm going to continue a little bit with the inclusionary zoning piece of what you were just talking about. So in order for Piedmont to reach its low income or very low income numbers in its RHNA allocation, what incentives is Piedmont putting in place to encourage those more affordable homes? And what is to prevent, why, if you're a private property owner in Piedmont and you're changing a single family home into a multi-family home, why are you not going to make it extremely, make it market rate so that you can earn a better profit on the multiple units that'll be in that building? how are you going to incentivize the lower income side of it?
So that's something we're going to need to figure out as we put together and develop the housing element. That we'll have to look at all types of incentives that can do. Currently, we're looking at well, we've drafted some objective design standards for multifamily construction. We'll probably want to apply that to the duplexes that SB 9 allows. And also for affordable, you know, we have them to some extent for ADUs already. So, you know, I think there's incentives on the regulatory end, and we'll see what we can do on incentives for, you know, limiting, but yeah, as I said, a lot of that we're going to have to figure out as we develop the housing element update.
Pierce, did you want to add on to that?
Laurel, I just would like to jump in and remind everyone that on October 21st, there will be a presentation and community workshop on incentives for ADUs, deed restricted ADUs. There will also be objective design standards, draft objective design standards for multifamily housing. So we're going to put those forward. We want to ask the community to give us feedback about them before we take them to the Housing Advisory Committee and Planning Commission. You can get more information at piedmontishome.org.
Thank you. Yes, I know Rani was plugging Piedmont is Home, and I have also been to that site, and it is well put together and has a lot of easily accessible information. So I also encourage all our viewers to go to piedmontishome.com. Yes.
.org.
.org. Okay, piedmontishome.org. Okay, so we have maybe time for one or two more questions. So I guess circling back to the RHNA and the housing element in your presentation, Rani, you highlighted some figures about 28% of housing needing to be for 1,500 or less per family. Can you elaborate a little bit on sort of the requirements for the different types of housing that are elaborated on in the RHNA?
Sure. You know, I don't think I can summon all the figures off the top of my head today, but I will say that, you know, one of the things that we discussed at the last meeting was the need to express that information in ways that make sense to a homeowner or someone who might build an ADU or, you know, build affordable housing, so that they understand, like, what are the rent levels we're talking about, because that helps them kind of evaluate the economics of doing the project at all, right? So we will be, I think, you know, undertaking to translate some of those RHNA goals into, you know, documents and information that is available for the public to get your heads around, you know, how does this all come together in a way that makes sense financially? And you know, I think there have been a few questions about what are the incentives to do it at all. So that's part of the programmatic piece of this, right? So the program, whether it's, you know, loans at very affordable rates or objective design standards, and there's other tools that you know, we can put in the toolbox to help pave the way and make it more accessible for people to actually produce the units. Otherwise, it's just words on pages.
A final question. So presumably there will be more people living in Piedmont if we have an increased number of homes here. Has the city been working with the school board and talking with the schools about how that's going to impact Piedmont schools? There have been a number of questions about sort of the relationship between housing and the schools, and concern about the quality of Piedmont schools.
Of Great question. And so, yes, part of the analysis that we'll be doing and that Lisa Wise and her team will be supporting us with is a CEQA analysis and a financial analysis of impact. Because we need to be holistic in how we look at this. You can't just, expand the population of the city by, a small city. I mean, we're what, 10,500 people. So if you add 500 people to Piedmont, I'm making that number up, so don't quote me. But if you add, a sizable number of people to the community, you're going to need to expand services commensurately, and you have to look at, the tax base that those new residents will bring in will probably not be proportionate or equivalent to the tax base of the other residents in Piedmont. If we're skewing to low income, I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. So then how do we cover the costs of the services and make sure that we maintain, the high level of services that we, enjoy in Piedmont? And so I think that's a very important question, and it's part of the analysis we'll be doing. I want to also, as we talk about services, I also want people to think about the, one of the things that I think, I've heard a lot of public support for is making room for seniors, making room for students, making room for teachers, making room for city staff and employees. If you think about the kinds of the people that we want to welcome in the community, it's a broad spectrum of people. So if you think about services for homeless folks, for example, that's one, array of needs and services that need to be met. But, teachers, seniors are going to need different kinds of service. Seniors will need different kinds of accommodations potentially in the space. A teacher is going to be a tenant and probably happy to not be driving an hour from wherever he or she might have lived otherwise. So there's lots of different ways to welcome lots of different kinds of people into the community, and I think we do need to be thoughtful about what's the fiscal impact on the city, and we'll be looking at that holistically.
Yeah, if I could clarify a little bit on that. So yeah, we have engaged the school district certainly to participate in the housing element update process and in a conversation with them. But I'll clarify that the state law prohibits us from using an impact on schools to say we can't make our RHNA allocation or to refuse to do so. But it is something, the CEQA analysis looks at all environmental impacts. So if there is an adverse impact on schools, it could be something that needs to be addressed in mitigation or not. So yes, definitely there, besides, schools, there's utilities and water capacity and all that kind of thing that will need to be addressed in the CEQA analysis of the housing element update.
And thank you for addressing the schools piece of it. It was one of the first things that I thought about when I got involved in this work, because, I think the schools are the crown jewel of Piedmont, and it's the reason people move here. So I think that has two implications. One is we want to make sure we maintain a high level of education in our community. And two, that we, maybe hopefully open up access to that high quality education to others. And I think that, on both of those counts, there's, we've gotten a lot of supportive comments from residents through the survey and the outreach that we've done, that people are excited to do that. I did do a quick check-in with the school board and the superintendent of schools on capacity, because I just wanted to understand, where are we relative to capacity in the community? Are we right up against it? And at the moment, we have a reasonable amount of capacity in the district. That is a very cyclical thing. We are heading into the dip from the Great Recession, so the dip in birth rates from the Great Recession. So there's a demographic reason for that drop, and it'll change again. We can't kind of count on that capacity remaining, but it at least tells us we're not right up against a crunch. But we know what it costs to build a new school, because we built one about 10 years ago, and it's probably a little more than that was 10 years ago. That's an investment that would have to get made if we dramatically increase the school population. So again, it's part of the CEQA analysis to understand those implications. Even if the state doesn't allow us to sort of use that as an excuse, we still have to, we can't be Pollyannish about it. We have to understand the impact because it's an important piece of the puzzle in Piedmont and the reason that people move here and the reason our property values are what they are. So I think we need to be, you know, mindful of that.
Melissa, I see you have a hand up. Was there one more thing you want to say before we close out?
I did, if it's okay. I
Sure.
just, I want to say that as we think about this, there's some of the issues that come up, they're pragmatically true. How do you deal with the issue on schools? How do you deal with water? How do you deal with infrastructure like sewer systems that were built for, you know, a long time ago? It's also true that those same issues can be very dog whistly. And so I just want to point out that the problem is that we have this conversation solely from the point of view often of the people who live in the community.
Mhm.
I don't mean to end negatively, but like the reality is Piedmont has, for all intents and purposes, a private school district. The reason it is so exceptional is because of the wealth of the people who live in that community and send their kids to those schools and can invest additional above and beyond the tax base into those schools. That's not the only reason, but certainly a big reason. Every kid in California deserves a school like Piedmont. The reality is we don't know how to deliver on that right now. We have limits to our tax policy on how to deliver on that now. It absolutely makes sense that Piedmont residents want to preserve one of the greatest jewels in their city, but it's important to balance the external and the internal piece. Like a conversation about water in Piedmont, when you drive through Piedmont and everybody has a huge lawn with sprinklers going all of the time, like you have to reshape that conversation about what is the right way to structure our community and how should we be using water? Not as Santa Barbara does, we can't have any more people live here because of water. And so I recognize that's not what the housing commission or the city council is doing it, but I just wanted to raise that in terms of part of the discussion, because at the end of the day, polling across the state says that people are willing to have density in their backyard. And they're willing, gentle density, most people aren't signing up for 50 units in their backyard, but you know, duplexes, fourplexes, even up to 10-unit buildings. And the real thing that we have to do is figure out how to balance all of these various things like water and transportation and parking and school quality. And one of the best ways we can do that, and I'll close on this for a future issue that you may want to have a conversation about, is housing policy is tax policy. Housing policy is revenue policy. Like without figuring out how we can bring in the right amount of money to communities, it's really hard to do this. And I think properly taxing land is one of them. And I think the ballot measure that failed to split roll Prop 15 is another example, right? That would have not only helped Piedmont, but it would have helped the communities around Piedmont, which helps Piedmont. I just want to say that.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate your perspective. And we are way over time, so I need to close. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you to all of our panelists, Melissa, Rani, and Gloria, and to Kevin and Pierce for jumping in with some of the more technical questions. Feel free to share the YouTube link with friends and family who weren't able to join us today, and consider subscribing to our YouTube channel and joining the league at lwvpiedmont.org. This officially ends our program, and I thank you so much for joining.